Let me just do a quick plot for upcoming events. We're going to have Sahil Malik talking about effective Silverlight, this coming up May 25th. And in June, we are going to talk about Oracle development with Visual Studio 2005. And in July, we are going to talk about some production challenges with ASP.NET with Omar Al-Zabir. And that's kind of long September. I'm going to talk about MVM VM patterns for Silverlight. As usual, here are all our links. If you're not yet on our Twitter and Facebook, and you can also use our calendar links so you have all our events in one place. So let's just jump here to this. We might actually do some surveys later on. Like every other quarter, we do this talk with Scott Guthrie, and all it is just questions. So like I said, if you can hear me, feel free to ask questions just using your Q&A tab up on the top. And Scott will answer them, and he chooses them in his own order. So I think we're ready, Scott.
Great. Thanks a bunch. People hear me okay? Yeah, so if you're new to live meetings, you go to the Q&A tab at the top of the screen. You can basically submit a question, and this is sort of an unplugged session, so I'll start off with a few words. But these things usually get a lot more interesting when you ask questions. And so if you can ask as many as you can, and whatever topic you want, what I'll try to do is basically go through the list. And I usually try to answer them, in a kind of, I'll try to answer a couple phone ones or a couple Silverlight ones or a couple web ones all at the same time to kind of provide a little bit more of a logical flow. We'll take the event however you want. So anyway, I want to say, again, a big thanks for everyone joining. It's been a pretty busy month and a half or 2 months for my team and probably for you if the demo of the products just shipped. Obviously, we just shipped VS 2010 and .NET 4 about 4 weeks ago. I think it was 4 weeks ago yesterday. Silverlight 4 we shipped about 3 and a bit weeks ago. And obviously as part of .NET 4, things like WPF 4, ASP.NET 4, EF4, WinForms 4, and ASP.NET MVC2 are all included. So I'm pretty excited right now, at least about kind of the initial feedback we've heard. It's been thankfully really good. If you do have any problems, do send me an email or ask them on the chat, and I can help. And hopefully, one of the things that you're finding with the new release is there's a bunch of new stuff, but at the same time, we focused a lot on how do we make the existing feature set and the existing developer workflow better. And so there's a lot of features that you can take advantage of that don't require reading a 1,000-page book. And if you follow my blog, my plan over the next couple of weeks or months, however long it takes me, is try to do a couple of blog posts per week that kind of show off how you can take advantage of some of the new features and put them in some context and allow you to be productive. So with that, enough of me blabbling. I'll open it up here and answer some questions here. See. Looks like I got a couple of questions on phone, so I'm going to start off with that. Jim Perry asked, any idea when developer hardware for Windows Phone 7 will be available? John Garland asked a question around why aren't we seeing more Windows Phone 7 MSDN articles? And Pravir asked a question about the price point for Windows Phone. So let me try to take those three right now and answer those. From a progress perspective, Windows Phone 7, we made a lot of noise about it at Mix a few weeks ago. And we shipped a CTP at Mix, and then we shipped another CTP refresh, I think it was about 10 days ago, that works with the final VS 2010 release. Windows Phone 7 for us is a pretty big release in that it's not just a new release in the sense of, more features, but it's kind of in some ways a fundamental reset of our phone strategy. It's a much more ambitious release in the sense of the a new user experience. The experience has gotten some really good reviews. It's a new developer experience based on Silverlight, and it's a new hardware form factor, or based on Silverlight NX and A, I should mention. And it's a new hardware form factor that's hardware accelerated, that's full touchscreen touch, and much more ambitious from that perspective. You'll see hardware devices show up in the months ahead. Partly because it's such new devices. We basically can create devices right now, but because we're still iterating with hardware vendors, devices at this stage, if you only build 1,000 of them, end up costing significantly more than what a final unit will cost in the store. We're still getting the phone in the point we're ready to give out hardware devices, but you'll see more of that, and we will start giving them out in the months ahead. Until then, you can use the emulator that comes with VS 2010, the tools for VS 2010. We also have a free Express edition of a phone SKU that's based on Visual Studio 2010. Both of them, the VS tool and the Express edition, include a built-in emulator that is hardware accelerated, that is touch enabled. You have a touch screen with Windows 7 that allows you to do development today. And to John's point, you will see a lot more tutorials, articles show up. Part of the reason they're not in MSDN magazines today is we typically, because it's a print magazine, we actually have to get the articles written, many months ago and started many months ago. And up until Mix in March, we really didn't have bits to give out to people to write about. And so, I'm sure you'll see, I don't know the editorial schedule for MSDN magazine, but you'll certainly see over the summer a lot more articles come out about it. And leading up to the launch, you'll see a lot of content about it. The good news is it's .NET, it's Visual Studio, Silverlight Next and at its core. So there is a lot of content out there already and a lot of knowledge and developers out there already that know now how to build phone apps. What you're going to see is us go to the next level in terms of telling you how to take most advantage of the phone, how do you build the most immersive experience, and how do you really target for that form factor. So you'll see a lot more information coming up in the near future. I want to ask, when's the final version of WCF RIA services going to be released? And also, why did you let Brad Abrams go? You'll see that the final release of WCF RIA services coming out real shortly. Keep an eye on my blog. Any day now. So do keep an eye on my blog, and I'll make sure to be hopefully the first blog about it. But you'll see the final release of WCF RIA services as well as the final release of the Silverlight 4 tools for Visual Studio 2010 coming out really quickly, really shortly now. Premier asked a question about the pricing of Windows Phone 7. Actually, I didn't mention that. We haven't announced anything yet. And typically, the way the pricing of phones work is also often really based on carriers and individual handset manufacturers. So we won't know for a while, but we're certainly looking to have the pricing of the phones be very competitive in the market. Let's see. Sean asked a question about best practices for lowering memory usage of Silverlight or WPF applications. You shouldn't see 200 megs of memory. If you send me email, I'll put you in touch with a guy named Rob Relia. There's some guidance that we have. At no point you have a set of guidances on the Codeplex site that include tools and guidance for profiling, doing memory analysis, and best practices. If you're seeing 200 megabytes, then there's a problem. You shouldn't be seeing that. So if you send me mail, I can put you in touch with someone who can help, and you can run profile tools that help diagnose where it's being spent. So I'll do a couple other, I guess, Silverlight questions. Brent asked, when will Blend support VS 2010? I think specifically you're talking about the .NET 4 compatibility and the project file compatibility. If you download the Expression Blend 4 beta that's available today, that is compatible with VS 2010. And once Blend 4 ships, then that shipping version will be compatible with VS 2010, meaning both .NET 4, VS 2010's project and solution files. But if you download the beta today, which is a free beta on the web, you should be set with VS 2010 immediately. And Andrew asked a question about the Silverlight 4 web browser control. Specifically, why is it only supported for out-of-browser applications? The browser control is a new control we added with Silverlight 4. It allows you to host HTML inside a Silverlight app. We consciously only made it available out-of-browser for a couple reasons. One is the complexity of implementing that across different browsers. Running it in browser is a little challenging. It's doable, but it's a little challenging. The bigger reason, though, is concern with making sure we don't inadvertently open up any type of phishing attack or enable you to kind of get, to have your Silverlight app potentially fall prey to the classic cross-site scripting and other style JavaScript attacks. There's just a lot of complexity in making sure you get that right. And hosting a browser control, we were worried, could we inadvertently open up something that we didn't mean to open up? And that's why for the first release, it's an out-of-browser control only, meaning you can run it in a Silverlight 4 app, but it needs to be an out-of-browser app, just because we figure that's an extra level of step and not as susceptible to those types of attacks. So it's something we'll look at for the future. Until then, there are DOM APIs supported with Silverlight so that you can actually reach out and program the HTML DOM of the page that the Silverlight app is being hosted in, and that works for all browsers. And so you can use that, and you can basically layer HTML on top of your Silverlight app as a way to kind of do those similar scenarios today. It's a little bit more involved. It's not quite as good as a web browser control like we have out of browser, but it does actually, I think, let you do the common scenarios. Timothy asked a question, will raw TCP UDP sockets be available for Windows Phone 7? And do you think the web browser control will ever be supported in browser? Oh, we just asked that. The raw TCP UDP sockets, I don't believe, I'm pretty sure UDP is not in the current Windows Phone 7 build, and I don't think TCP is, but I'm not 100% sure. That is something that will show up eventually. But it's not, unfortunately, in the builds today. And I don't know which release will show up, but it's definitely something that we're going to be adding in the future. Alan asked a question about what do we expect about enterprise adoption rate of Silverlight 4 compared to previous versions? In general, I think we're expecting to see pretty good enterprise adoption of Silverlight 4. In general, I'd say I'm always a little surprised when I go and visit customers the number of big enterprises that are rolling out pretty gigantic Silverlight projects, even with Silverlight 3, which wasn't really designed for line of business or enterprise internal focus scenarios. Silverlight 4 obviously is, and so I expect to see a lot more momentum, and obviously with ES 2010 shipping with the tooling support for Silverlight that's improved, I think we'll probably see a lot more adoption along those lines. The new version of Office that just shipped yesterday, the Web Companions and some SharePoint, and the communicator apps do use Silverlight, and so I think you'll see as enterprises upgrade their PCs and roll out Office, you also see people increasingly installing Silverlight there as well. So I expect the enterprise adoption to be hopefully pretty good. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of the enterprise deployment is that Silverlight integrates with what we call the WSUS infrastructure, which is the way that enterprises roll out patches and updates to Windows and other Microsoft components. And you can deploy Silverlight that way in an automated way. So if you are an enterprise or working for an enterprise that manage, up to 100,000 seats, their administrators can actually, in only a few minutes, actually set up Silverlight to be deployed across all those 100,000 PCs in an automated way without requiring any manual intervention. So it is actually easy to deploy, and as more apps and more projects go live, I expect to see more deployment along those lines. Let me see. Let me do one or two more Silverlight, and then we'll switch gears and do some VS and ASP.NET and WPF. Let's see. Roger asked about Android support and what the plan is there. We haven't announced any Android support just yet. It is something we'll continue to look at, but it's something that we haven't announced just yet, but it is something that we'll continue to look at there. Greg Duncan asked a question, what's the plan for VS 2010 and .NET 4 SP1, meaning will there be a lot of new features like there was with the VS 2008 .NET 3.5 SP1 release, or will it be more of a normal bug fix release? In general, I think you'll see, we haven't announced any SP1 plans. In general, I'd say the bug inflow that we're seeing is actually lower than we expected, which is nice. But generally, our servicing plans, the way we approach it is, we'll typically look to do, if there's a lot of people running into a common bug, we'll do what's called a GDR or a hotfix roll-up to kind of address that immediately. We haven't seen the need to do that yet. It's something that literally we watch every Watson crash dump that comes in. We watch the connect bugs, trying to see what are the pain points people have. We haven't, at least yet, touch wood, seen a high density of issues around a particular area or a particular issue, but something we'll keep an eye on. Our current plan is basically, we haven't announced any dates with SP1, but for SP1 to be more of a bug fix release. And so we don't have as many plans to add new features with SP1. Typically, sometimes we add a few things, but I think you'll probably see SP1 be more kind of focused around pure bug fixing. Anyway, that's the current thinking. The other questions. Joel asked, do you anticipate the same pace of delivery for Silverlight over the next year plus? It's a good question. Pace is always one of those things that it's hard to measure a little bit. Certainly, I'd say my team feels like they're working as hard as they ever have. The pace of development, I guess, is going as fast. In terms of releases, one of the things you're going to see with Silverlight is, us show up on other platforms, more device form factors like phone. You're going to continue to see innovation throughout the stack. So, you're going to continue to see us innovating. As we go to more devices, people, the amount of innovation will be the same or increase. That doesn't necessarily mean that the rate of features on any one platform will be the same as it's been. Meaning for us to do good things on the phone and do things good on other form factors like set-top boxes, we end up having to do the work a couple times in some ways. But right now we're planning on continue to innovate pretty fast. I don't know if the release cadence will be quite as frequent. Now that we have more and more developers building on Silverlight, and now that we've reached the point where the feature set is, I'd say, complete enough, I'm not sure we need to do kind of 9 months or 8 months is what we've been averaging, just because customers and developers using us find that sometimes both exhilarating and a little exhausting. But you're going to still see the same level of investment and pace in terms of feature improvements and additions, hopefully for the next future. See. One or two more Silverlight, and then I'll switch gears and do a bunch of ASP.NET and WPF. Bill Reese asked a question, is there a time frame for when Silverlight 3 users will automatically be upgraded to Silverlight 4? So built into Silverlight is sort of an auto-update mechanism that we can turn on that will, by default, kind of upgrade people's Silverlight usages to the latest version. We are going to be turning that on in a few weeks' time. Typically what we do is when we do a big release, we kind of like put it out in the wild and watch it for a little while. Because once we turn the auto update on, we basically update about 80% of the people in the span of about 72 hours. So if there's any problem in terms of a bug that people are running into, that can cause problems. And so we've basically been watching, it's only been out there 3 weeks now. We've basically been watching, hearing reports from people, say, hey, I'm running into an issue or whatever, investigating it, make sure we understand everything. We'll probably fix fix 1 or 2 small issues before we turn on the auto enrollment bit. And then once we do that, it very quickly gets deployed to hundreds of millions of machines. So I can't say the exact date, but we do have a date in mind for when we're planning on pushing the switch, and then every couple days we evaluate. Hey, did anything pop in that we need to worry about that would adjust it? And so far I think we're on track and feeling good about it. Tell you what, I'm going to come back to some Silverlight ones in a bit, but let me answer a few .NET, ASP.NET ones, and then we'll come back. Let's see. There's some other ones here. I had a few that you find. So one question was, what would you see as the single biggest advantage, disadvantage of using MVC over web forms? So that's the question that Matt asked. Good question. There's a video on, if you go to www.asp.net website, on the Getting Started tab, there's a video from Scott Hanselman called Choosing Web Forms or MVC, or Choosing Your Programming Model, which talks a little bit about that. It's a nice 4 or 5 minute video that summarizes kind of what are the characteristics of both web forms and MVC, and what are the advantages of each. To your question about what's the single biggest advantage or disadvantage of MVC over web forms, I think the two biggest advantages that people who like MVC call out are if you're someone who really wants more control over your HTML and your interactions in terms of form posts and potentially even your JavaScript, MVC is a slightly lower level programming model in that it doesn't abstract as much as, say, a controls-based model does with web forms. And so if you're someone who likes that control, if you're someone who likes to drive a manual stick shift in the car because you like being able to change the gears, then, MVC gives, a lot of people really like that, and they find that refreshing. I think the other thing that people really like about MVC is if you've embraced kind of a unit testing and agile-based methodology, MVC makes it a lot easier to unit test the UI component of your application. And so it kind of pushes you towards a separation of concerns and a very patterns-based approach. So if you're one of those two people and you really like MVC, I think the thing that MVC, I think, had a lot of buzz online, and we've seen a great uptake in terms of people using it. It's still probably only used by about 10% of people that are using ASP.NET, at least from what we see in terms of download samples and things like that. It's certainly growing very quickly, but it's still it's not like everyone's doing MVC and no one's using web forms. And we don't want people going to MVC because they think they need to. Web forms has had a ton of improvements with .NET 4 and with ASP.NET 4, and we'll continue to support and improve it going forward. I do think we'll see more adoption because of MVC2 being included in VS 2010. MVC2, I think, also kind of filled in a lot of not holes per se, but a lot of gaps, or just sort of rounded out the feature set of the MVC1 release in a nice way. The other thing I mentioned for everyone is, and I'll blog about it once they're available, is 2 good tutorials that Joe Stagner and John Galloway have been working on that are really designed from I don't know anything about web forms, I don't know anything about MVC, how do I build a net? And they're about 80 pages. They'll be both HTML and PDFs that you can download. And it's sort of like, we'll start with File New Project, we'll create a database, we'll create a data model, we'll create all the code, and we'll walk through how to do everything. And so you'll see that show up on the ASP.NET site in a bigger way probably later this month. And one's called Tailspin, and one's called MVC Music Store. And the goal behind that is it's not to try to explain everything about web forms or MVC, but the goal is basically for people, especially getting started, how do we make it easier to learn and someone has an open mic if they muted there. How do they make it easier to learn and make progress? And so we'll be pushing that more aggressively in the weeks ahead. It's currently kind of in beta format, and we're incorporating feedback along the way. Other questions? Nathan asked a question about the Visual Studio 2010 SKUs. For a lot of people that don't know, we changed the product SKU structure. SKU stands for a stocking unit, but it's basically the version of Visual Studio. We changed the version of Visual Studios around a little bit with the VS 2010 release. One thing we tried to do in general is just simplify the number of versions out there. And so we basically have the Express Edition, we have the Pro Edition, we have a Premium Edition, and Ultimate Edition. And so on the VSTS Architect and tested, we used to have a bunch of different SKUs. Now we kind of have a more streamlined approach. Nathan's question was, how do we decide what we allocate feature-wise into the different versions? Do we use market data? Do we do industry mapping? Do we use compete data? The reality is we do kind of all of it, to be honest with you. Part of the reason we had the fewer products was to make the choices simpler. And we tried to make sure that, like, the VS 2010 Pro SKU had more features than the VS 2008 Pro SKU by a significant margin. And we wanted to make sure the Premium Edition of VS 2010, which basically had significantly more features than the other ones, and likewise Ultimate had the other ones. We do look at competitive data. There are other tools manufacturers out there, obviously, in particular in the Java space for enterprises. And so we do look at kind of how they distribute. We use a lot of customer usage feedback. We try to make sure all the kind of core features that we think professional developers need day in and day out are in the Pro Edition. And so, things like unit testing, things like I'm going to do a blog post maybe tonight, hopefully the next couple of days on TDD support in VS 2010. All that core stuff is just in the Pro Edition. And everywhere. And then some of the higher-end value in terms of that we see in particular being used in the enterprise market space are in the Premium and Ultimate editions of the products. If you are an MSDN subscriber today, one thing to also know is that if you've bought one of the VSTS products in the past, you can automatically step up to the Ultimate product. So there's a nice kind of upgrade path and also kind of a one-year promotion path so that for a year, even if you bought a cheaper version of MSDN subscription, you can actually try out the Ultimate Edition if you want. And the other nice thing is once you renew, the renewal price is actually at the lower rate as well. So if you haven't heard about the Ultimate offer in MSDN and you are an MSDN subscriber, definitely worth checking out. You can save a boatload of money that way. Other questions? Around .NET 4. Dimitri asked a question about link to SQL and Entity Framework. What's the attitude in terms of link to SQL versus EF? When do I choose which? And what are some of the improvements that have happened to link to SQL? If you follow me on Twitter, my Twitter address is twitter.com/ScottGoo. I actually linked to a blog post that Damien Gard put out. So if you search for Damien, D-A-M-I-E-N, space Gard, G-U-A-R-D, and then link to SQL, you'll see a good blog post he did which summarizes a bunch of the improvements that have been made to .NET with link to SQL in .NET 4. I'm about to start a Entity Framework series on my blog post, on my blog, probably the first one out in the next week. I talked a little about EF4 as well, since I did a Link to SQL series about 2 years ago. I'll probably do an equivalent one talking about Entity Framework, how to use it, and then some of the improvements that came as part of the EF4 release. Entity Framework 4 has had a bunch of improvements. In general, I'd say, so the high-level thing is both are being supported. Both will continue to be supported going forward. One is not dying. You don't have to switch. In terms of starting new projects, with VS 2008 and .NET 3.5, I was a big fan of Link to SQL. I liked it because it was very focused, easy to learn, and it had the features that I needed. And Entity Framework was more powerful in some ways, but didn't have all the features I wanted in the 3.5 SP1 release. I think that the data team with EF4 has done a great job in terms of addressing and filling in the feature set. And EF4, I think, is a great release. I think the SQL 4 is a great release as well. But if I was going to start a new project, you know, with .NET 3.5 SP1, I would probably choose Link to SQL. With .NET 4, you know, I've been using EF4 more for my brand new projects. You know, the great thing is both use Link. You can use both. They both will exist for, you know, eons and eons and eons. So there's no need to switch if you've already started one or the other. Both are great options. And I'll be doing a blog series on, since I already did one on Link to SQL, on EF. So if you are interested in learning more about it, I'll talk more about it in the weeks ahead on my blog. Gary asked a question about magic strings in ASP.NET MVC. Yeah, I always, you know, so basically, if people aren't familiar, there's a, you know, one of the things that people often, you know, focus on with, you know, coding is, or how do you not have magic strings, so to speak, in your code? So this is true actually even also for, I call magic numbers. You know, so rather than have, you know, 5 be a number, you might want to make it a constant so that it's a little clearer as to what in the world 5 means. And, you know, one of the things that people, a few people have said is with, you know, with web programming, you know, when do you use strings versus when do you use either a static or some type of strongly typed lambda when you refer to things. With ASP.NET MVC1, for example, in your views, when you use the HTML helpers, like HTML.textbox, which generates a text box from a model property, you used to say like HTML textbox, parentheses, quote, you know, product name, and that the product name was a string, and that's how it referenced it. With ASP.NET MVC2, we moved to a model where we use lambdas when, you know, where we support helpers that use lambdas. You don't have to. You can still use the string versions. But you can use lambdas to reference the model. The benefit there is you get IntelliSense, and anytime you rename the model property or refactor it, you'll get a compile error as opposed to getting a runtime error. So, and I have a blog post from earlier this year, I think it's from January, on the ASP.NET MVC2 release, and I'm going to continue that series, pick that up shortly again. But basically talking about the new HTML4 helper functions that you can use. So MVC2, in many ways, I think, makes that a lot easier to use. A couple people will still point out, though, if you use the action link helpers and the route link helpers, those still take strings. And those strings point to kind of action names. It's an interesting, and we've gone back and forth as to kind of what the best approach is there. Some people say, hey, the string, so it must be bad. What's interesting is you're not linking necessarily to a method or a property in that case. If you're linking to a route, you know, that route is logically a name as opposed to necessarily a method. It sometimes often is backed by a method, and so you know, a lot of people do want to make it strongly typed, but it isn't in all cases. There's a helper library called T4MVC that you can download that will actually generate strongly typed helpers for you automatically, so that you can do strong naming of your links and routes. Personally, you know, and I'm sure people will disagree with me, but personally, I don't think that's a huge barrier. I don't think it's a huge problem to actually use strings for links and routes. You know, different people will obviously have different opinions. You know, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, they're all text formats, so it isn't like we're not using strings elsewhere in our apps. But if you do want to always use strongly typed helpers for your links and routes, the T4MVC project is a great way to do it, and integrates great within ASP.NET MVC2. Other questions here. Mark Reamans asked questions about what are the unit test improvements in VS 2010? Are there any? There's actually a ton of new unit test improvements in VS 2010. Some of them are just in unit testing in general. You know, the test harness is richer, it runs faster. Unit tests templates are now cleaner by default. Probably some of the two biggest ones, though, I think, are, I'd say the three biggest ones are, one that I'm going to do, I'm halfway through a blog post on right now, is the support for what we call consume first IntelliSense and generate from usage. This is really good for test-driven development, where you're writing your tests first and then generating your code second. It kind of gets you a nice, smooth flow. You know, CodeRush and I think, and obviously ReSharper supports this today for 2008, but it's now built into VS 2010 Professional and higher, really makes sort of a much more seamless TDD, test-driven development workflow that obviously works great with critical with unit tests. Unit tests is a critical part of the TDD workflow. I didn't mean to imply that unit tests equal TDD. But I'll blog about that feature. That I think is nice to have, the fact that all Visual Studio 2010 editions have it. I think will help in terms of organizations that do want to use TDD or introduce TDD in unit tests. Makes it a lot easier. Other features that are really nice is a feature called Test Impact. This allows you to actually profile your unit test and see, when you make a code change, what unit tests need to be rerun. So we actually have the smarts to look at what code paths are being executed by your unit tests and only rerun those unit tests that need to when you make a change. The third thing then to look at that I think is pretty nice is TFS 2010. This is now included as a free component of all MSDN subscriptions. Even if you're an MSDN professional subscription, you now have TFS 2010 for free, or it's included as part of your subscription. One nice thing about TFS 2010, or this is true for TFS 2008 as well, is it does support gated check-in. So you can implement what's called continuous integration, so that every time you do a check-in, you can automatically run all your unit tests, and only if they succeed are you allowed to check in. And the fact is that TFS 2010 is now much easier to set up, and enabling that type of continuous integration is kind of a one checkbox thing. Makes it much easier to kind of integrate unit tests. So hopefully that's a quick sampling of some of the unit test improvements in this release. Louise, I did see that the new look replacement. Kind of funny. If people haven't seen it, you can check it out. I'll have to think about that in terms of whether that's my new look or not. It certainly is a look, and it's pretty amusing. Let's see. Gally, you asked a question about the new dynamic support in C#, which is are there other real usages for it besides COM interoperability? So a lot of people that don't know, C#4 now includes a new dynamic keyword that allows you to kind of access properties and methods on objects in a lace-down fashion. And the question here was, what are all the scenarios for when you use it? COM interop is a big one, and mainly the benefit with having the dynamic support is you don't have to create TLB imps and kind of go through an explicit import process in order to call and reference lace-bound COM objects, or even early-bound COM objects for that matter. So that's one big benefit. The other benefit I'd say for dynamic in general is just if there's cases where you want to access a library in a late-bound way, if you're calling a Python or Ruby or JavaScript API from .NET, having the dynamic support makes it easier because those languages are late-bound. In order to do it. So in general, I think there's lots of improvement or lots of capabilities you can there take advantage of. Stephen Brocker mentioned, I saw a link to the NBC Music Store sample that I mentioned earlier being posted. It is on Codeplex today. And if you go to the ASP.NET website, on the at the bottom there's a Community Spotlight. And you can see kind of regularly as we post updates. Today, if you go to the ASP.NET website and then click on the NBC tab, you'll find tons of NBC resources. And if you scroll down under ASP.NET NBC sample applications, there's a link to the NBC Music Store as well. It's posted on Codeplex right now, so the link on ASP.NET/NBC will take you there. we're looking to create kind of an HTML version after we've rolled in some feedback and fixes into it. And so you'll see kind of a much nicer HTML layout of it, and we'll be promoting it even more on the site once we roll it out. Let's see, other questions. Nashman asked a question about, are we going to be rolling out Windows Phone 7 in other countries like China and India? Ultimately, we're going to be rolling out Windows Phone 7 to all countries. There's kind of a roadmap, and I don't know, unfortunately, off the top of my head, the exact country roadmap for doing that, but there is definitely a roadmap for when we're going to roll out what in different countries. I believe certainly India and China are on that list of countries that will be supported definitely going forward. Coder Dennis asked the question, will .NET 4 be pushed out by a Windows update, and if so, when? Yes, it will be pushed out with Windows Update. It will happen early this summer is the current plan. We haven't announced a specific date because dates can always change, but sometime this summer we are looking to enable .NET 4 on Windows Update so that people will get that. That's, to be clear, distinct from Silverlight 4. This is talking about .NET 4, which is part of Windows. That'll be rolled out through Windows Update. Silverlight 4 will then be rolled out through Microsoft Update, which is for products that are not in Windows. Roy J. asked a question, I'd like to make more use of creating my own code snippets, but unless I'm missing something, the process seems a little cumbersome to create your own snippets. So if you haven't found them, code snippets, I did a blog post on this. This is actually maybe a good blog post for me at some point to talk about. But I did do a blog post about using snippets in the past. Roy's question is about creating your own snippets. You can definitely create your own. If you actually search for, I forget the name of it, but if you search for Visual Studio Code Snippet Creator, I think what you'll do is you'll probably find a couple of plugins people have created. So there's one called SnipDog, it looks like, on Codeplex, and there's a few other ones around here. Anyway, you can download some extensions to VS that make it a lot easier to create your own snippets. So I'd rather than write them by hand, I definitely recommend downloading that tool. And it can make it a heck of a lot easier in order to create. Other questions, and then we'll go back and do more on Silverlight ones. Danny asked a question, which is, when will Azure support .NET 4? The Azure team said within, I think, 90 days of shipping .NET 4, it'll be supported on Azure. So I think we're up to 30 days now. So I don't know exactly the time frame, but I know it will be definitely within the next month or two. Going forward, we are going to look to see, Azure is still kind of a relatively new service, which is why it's taking a little bit longer to roll out. Going forward, we are looking to make sure that with future versions of .NET, how do we make sure that, like, the day the .NET 5 ships or .NET V Next, that we have it supported. So I don't know the exact date, but it is coming soon that it'll be supported on Azure. Gary asked a question, is there a mercurial to TFS bridge? Are there plans to support that? I'm not sure, Gary, but if you send me email, I'll put you in touch with the TFS team, and they would know for sure, and could probably point you at that. Mr. James asked a question about, are there any ongoing efforts to produce VS doc files for jQuery UI, and is there any way to contribute to that project? That's a great suggestion. I don't know what the plans are. Shoot me mail on it, though. I'd love to put you in touch with the guys that are driving some of our Ajax work. Yeah, let's see if we can make that happen. That would be great. That's a really good suggestion. There was another Ajax question earlier. Someone was asking about ASP.NET Ajax. Let me pull that up. So Raj asked the question: will the Microsoft ASP.NET Ajax library become a maintenance release as we support jQuery more? It's important. So the answer is no. ASP.NET Ajax is not going away. It's important, though, I think, to differentiate. ASP.NET Ajax is kind of many things. One is the server-side pieces. So, in other words, update panel, all the ASP.NET controls, including the controls inside the Ajax control toolkit. And then there's the client-side library pieces, like the ability to create classes in JavaScript and some of the client object model pieces in ASP.NET Ajax. In general, what we're saying is the server-side pieces we're definitely continuing to enhance support and bring out new features for. So that's definitely not going away, and that's definitely not going to be lost at all. We are investing less right now in the client-side pieces. So we're investing less in that and more in jQuery for that. The main reason for that is jQuery had a lot of the features that we were going to end up adding anyway, things like selectors, things like animation, things like, things along those lines. And we basically said, rather than try to compete with jQuery, why don't we embrace it and make it work great with ASP.NET, with Visual Studio, and with our products? And how do we then take our features that we want to add and contribute them as plugins? And so I did a blog post, I think it was last week. The weeks blur together sometimes. I think it was last Thursday, on contributing the new templating library in binding support to jQuery. And so if you check out my blog at weblog.net/SkyGoo, you can see an article about that. It's features like that we're looking to contribute more for client-side scenarios into jQuery going forward. The server-side pieces, though, with ASP.NET Ajax, definitely not going away. They're used by hundreds of thousands of people, and we'll continue to enhance them going forward and add new features to them. See. Jeff Lomax asked the question, is there a way to set up ES 2010 MS tests on a build server without having to install a full IDE? I think the answer is yes, but I'm not 100% sure. Send me an email and I'll find out for sure. I thought you could actually run the unit test, but I'm not 100% sure. So send me an email and I'll find out for you, though, for sure from the team. Bill Walter asked the question, one pain point with prior releases of TFS and VS is the installation quickly gets out of the phase with the latest versions of Windows and SQL. The question is sort of, how do you get them working with the latest releases? I think with TFS, TFS works, I believe, on 2008, I think even on 2003, I'm not sure. So I think it's actually in sync with it. TFS does now also work with SQL Express. So you can basically use kind of an embedded SQL Express and still have a different SQL on the box. In general, in terms of why don't we coordinate everything with just one release, mainly it's because different things do ship on different time frames, and if we held everything to only always ship on one day, there's some benefit to that, but also then people would complain that things weren't coming out faster or this and that wasn't fixed. So we do try to be kind of deliberate in terms of our release schedules between VS, SQL, and Windows, and Office for that matter. But there are times when things do come out on a slightly different release schedule, and we're trying to make sure from an installation perspective we do try to make it as easy as possible. Brian Sullivan asked a question, which is, hey, I heard rumblings a few months ago about Microsoft working on an active record implementation on top of Entity Framework. Is this still being worked on? And if so, can we expect any type of preview soon? We're not. Yeah, so we looked at it from a data API perspective. we have looked at a couple of things. One of the things in general, so I should preface, I don't run the data team, so I don't speak for the data team entirely. I think in general, one bit of feedback we've heard, and I've certainly contributed, is we don't necessarily need a new data API. We've got a bunch of them already, and so I think right now our plans are not to try to introduce like a new pattern. Instead, is to build on top of a lot of the work that we've already done. What we are focusing on, though, and you'll see some either CTPs out today, is the thing we call code first or code only with the Entity Framework 4. And this is using Entity Framework 4, so it's not a new data API or platform per se, but it basically allows you to create POCO objects, so plain old CLR objects. So you just say public class product with a couple of properties, and then basically do the mapping to a database. And that can give you a very clean model for defining your entities and doing things with them. And so there is kind of a way of so there's a CTP out there that lets you do that. We're continuing to productize it and ultimately ship it as a fully supported product, so it's in preview form today. And as part of that, we are looking to say, like, you have full control over defining your mapping, so full fluent API, which a lot of, I think, the more advanced developers have asked for. But as part of that, we're also looking at how can we have very smart conventions by default. So if you want to have a fairly straightforward class maps to table kind of pattern, you can do that without writing any configuration code and without having to wire up anything, without having to use a designer. You can just create standard old classes with standard properties, no basis classes, very cleanly mapped to and from the database, and basically allow you to write apps with a minimal amount of code. So, so I do think that's that gives you some of the benefits that people have asked for in terms of, hey, a really simple data API, but the benefit is it's all EF, and so it's not a completely new thing. It's basically building on top of Entity Framework. So I'll blog about that more as well as part of this series that I'm doing, and you'll see that show up in preview form a little bit later. Martin asked a question, will Prism continue to be supported and enhanced in the future? I believe the answer is yes. I don't know 100% the plans for Prism. That's not actually built in my team. If you send me mail about a specific question or specific roadmap there, feel free to send me mail, and be happy to follow up on that and see what the plan is there. Other questions. So John Lewis asked a question about upgrading between 2008 and 2010, and yeah, so that's I just started parsing your question there, John. John Lewis asked a question about sort of upgrading existing apps from 2008 to 2010. What does the migration path look like? How hard is it? And are there incompatibilities? A couple of things about the 2010 release. One is you can install 2010 on the same machine as 2008 or 2005 or 2003. So you can definitely install both versions on the same machine, and it'll continue to work side by side without any impact. That's true not only for Visual Studio, that's also true for .NET 4 and .NET 3.5 as well. So that is certainly possible and certainly doable. You can then open existing projects with ES 2010 that you built in either 2005 or 2008 or 2003, and we'll upgrade the projects to 2010. Now, as part of that upgrade process, well, by default, when you do that, we won't roll forward the application to use .NET 4, or we won't roll it forward to use Silverlight 4. We'll continue to use the version of .NET and the version of Silverlight that the app was built against. So if you have the ES 2008 Silverlight 3 app that is using .NET 3.5, by default, it'll continue to use that when you open it up inside Visual Studio 2010. The benefit with that is you don't have to retest the application on a completely different platform. you can kind of, continue maintaining it, knowing, hey, it's still using the same CLR, the same version of ASP.NET, the same version of WCF as it was before, things continue along their merry way. You can then optionally go into the project properties of an individual project and upgrade it to use .NET 4, at which point we'll actually go through the project, try to fix up any breaking changes, and in general, it should only take you a short period of time in order to have that project now running and working against the newer version of the .NET runtime. So, it should be much easier in order to upgrade and to, make all that work. So, in general, again, you should be able to open your projects, edit them using VS 2010, but keep them on the same runtime, and then optionally choose to roll forward the runtime to the latest version. The one caveat Scott should be aware of is the project and solution file format has changed between 2008 and 2010. So while the code will still work against .NET 3.5, and you can even create, but the project file format, once you open it inside 2010 and save it, you can't open the same project in 2008. That is the one thing to be aware of. There is a utility out there that lets you change the project file format. A lot of people often ask us, hey, why did you change the project file format? And why don't you support the ability to export to a different project file format, an older project file format? The main reason is not because we couldn't figure out how to make the XML files work. It's mainly because some of the designers in 2010 do generate different types of code generation versus 2008. And so we were afraid that people would make changes in 2010, open the same changes up in 2008, and expect it to continue to work. And there are cases when that will not happen. And so that's why we actually don't automatically support an export feature to 2008. If you don't use the designers and you just use code editor, that's not as much of an issue, and you can use this free tool that's out there to change the project file format. But if you're using, the workflow designer or the data designers, or even the web forms designer, we want to be careful to make sure that you didn't inadvertently make a change and not realize the implications of it. Let's see, other questions. Ian asked a question, when do you use MEF versus an IOC container? What's the benefit of one versus the other, and when do you use which? So MEF stands for the Managed Extensibility Framework, and it's built in .NET 4, and it's a pretty cool feature for exposing extensibility within your .NET apps and wiring up extensions into your apps as well. And so Visual Studio 2010 itself is actually built using MEF, and so if you build a plugin to the editor, for example, you typically build it as a MEF extension, and that's how it wire up and find it. And so it makes it easier to sort of self-discover extensions and hook them up. There's an element of dependency wire-up that MEF supports. And so there's another concept out there called dependency injection or dependency containers, often sometimes called inversion of control containers or IOC containers. MEF, we don't really position MEF as a full frontal or full-featured dependency injection or IOC framework. That wasn't really what we designed it for. It has some key characteristics of a dependency injection or IOC framework, but it's sort of in V1, our main goal was around extensibility and wiring of extensions, which is scenarios that IOC and dependency injection frameworks often don't support or don't support very well. And so it's if you want a true dependency injection or IOC framework, I would use one, and there's lots of good ones for .NET. If you're looking to expose extensibility and especially allow third parties to plug in extensions into your app, that's where MEF really shines. And you can use both MEF and an IOC container together, so it's not a mutually exclusive, you do one or the other. But if you're building a client or a server app and you wanted people to build plugins or to dynamically wire up components, that's where I'd recommend MEF. And Glenn Block has a good blog and a bunch of articles that talk more about that. Other questions. Martin asked a question, when do I sleep? And how do I manage my time between blogging, speaking, traveling, etc.? I don't sleep quite as much as I'd like sometimes. I usually go to bed somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. and I usually get up around more time between 6:30 and 7:30. But last night I think it was 2:30 to 7. So that was not a good night. But that's usually the time frame when I sleep. In terms of kind of how I manage my time, the irony is a lot of people think I blog, speak, and travel a lot, and I actually probably do. Believe it or not, that's actually not my day job. I just do that for fun on the side. My day job is actually building the products and running the teams that build the products. And so I actually don't do any of the blogging part really during the day. I usually do that at night after my family goes to bed. During the day, I'm actually spent all my time building and running the engineering teams that build the products. In terms of kind of how I balance it, one of the things I try to focus on, and it's partly why I do blog and travel and speak a lot, is, I think sometimes, you can get into and we're guilty of this a lot, is you kind of build a feature and you feel good you built a feature, but if only a handful of people use it, or only a handful of people use it well, then you really didn't get the value out of the investment in the feature you created. And, the software world today is a big, complex thing. It's always been a big, complex thing, and it's as big and complex today as it probably ever has been. And, I certainly hear from a lot of people that use .NET and BS of like, what should I do? How do I be successful? How do I get started? How do I do this task? And, I try to use blogging and speaking and traveling as a way to kind of help educate, show off the features, help people maximize the product as much. And so I do kind of prioritize that in terms of doing that, because I think that's an important part of actually building the product, is actually helping people be successful with it. So that's kind of why I do it. It is a balance. It is a trade-off. There are some weeks and some days when I'm so busy and I have so much email in the evening that I end up doing kind of, I'd say, lighter posts or lighter things. This week the last 2 weeks, I've done posts on, I think last night I did one on the VS 2010 wallpapers on my blog, which, it's a fun thing. A lot of people seem to really like it. It's not the deepest post I've done. And then, I'll try to do a deep post that might be, multiple pages and take me 6 or 7 hours to write that's really gnarly. And so I try to balance it off a little bit as well, of having, lighter stuff and then kind of deeper stuff. And a lot of it comes down to what's going on at work. If work's really busy, you'll see me do some lighter stuff. And if I have some free time and I can actually escape to go to Starbucks, I'll do some deeper stuff in the evening in terms of blog posts. Other quick questions. Brett asked the question, if the user installs the full .NET 4, do they still need to install Silverlight 4 as well in order to run Silverlight 4 apps? I thought that I'd read that Silverlight 4 will run on .NET 4. No, you do actually still need to install Silverlight 4. So Silverlight is different than .NET, and so if you build a Silverlight app, you need to install Silverlight. If you install .NET, you need to install .NET. If you're just running a Silverlight app, you don't need to install .NET. If you're just running a full .NET app, you don't need to install Silverlight. They do have a compatible API surface set, but the runtimes are different. And then often, that has some benefits in terms of it makes it, among other things, just easier to get installed and get your apps working. But the runtimes are different. What we have added with Silverlight 4 is the ability to share binaries between Silverlight 4 and .NET 4 so that you can create like business logic and common utility libraries and actually have the same binary code run in both apps. And you'll see us do more and more of that going forward in terms of supporting. Other questions. Ian asked, speaking of talks, he was at my talks I just gave in Arizona on Monday. How did I like the weather? Basically, I'd say your weather is so much better than my weather. Although we have a good day today. I like warm weather, and there's Kyle asked a question about balancing jQuery code and server-side code. What's the right suggestions for balancing the two, and when do you use the two effectively in tandem? In general, I'd say one of the reasons why we like jQuery, and we've been adding support for it, is it's a nice framework in that it doesn't require you to. It certainly makes it a lot easier to write client-side code, but it doesn't require you to write. It doesn't have a ton of abstractions that you need to understand, and it allows you to very incrementally add it to pages. There's other frameworks out there that are great, Dojo, XJS, and others that are great frameworks, but you tend to actually have to kind of decide up front you're gonna potentially write a little bit more client-side code before you start your application. And they have some concepts above and beyond what's in base HTML, powerful concepts, but you need to learn. And the nice thing about jQuery is it's a little more lightweight. And so if you just want to AJAX enable a certain scenario, it tends to be pretty easy to do that without having to rewrite a bunch of stuff. And so we see that as a nice library to work with server-side technology like ASP.NET because you can keep a lot of your logic on the server side, certainly your data logic and things like that, and then you can nicely add more client functionality as is. We're going to be doing, hopefully a blog, we're probably going to start a blog series on this in the next couple of weeks, and then we're also, the AJAX tab on the www.asp.net website will probably have a whole bunch of tutorials starting shortly that show off how to take advantage of jQuery with ASP.NET, and that I think will go to your question of sort of showing off the balance and integration between client and server-side code in a richer way. Let's see, other questions. Vladimir asked a question. It's sort of HTML gets richer, both with AJAX and obviously with HTML5. What's my personal preferred platform for building new internet line of business apps? Is it Silverlight or is it HTML5? It's a good question. I think of it less in terms of HTML5 and more a question of HTML AJAX. Since you can certainly build line of business apps using HTML and AJAX today. HTML5 enables certain things to get richer, but I kind of think of it as more of a continuation of server-side, or not necessarily server-side, but more in terms of HTML, AJAX, server-side lob apps today. In terms of the thing I always tell people as they're looking at Silverlight is, use Silverlight for what it's good at. Use HTML for what it's good at. Don't try to use them for what they're not good at. So Silverlight is really good at certainly obviously media. It's good at building out-of-browser applications. It's going to be good at building mobile applications, and it's very good at building line of business apps that run inside the browser. At the same time, it's important to distinguish, I think, as you think about apps, what's the difference between the HTML form that's just doing a simple edit and post versus something that is more of an app that has even more logic and more workflow and navigation UI and kind of logic on the client side. And that's where, if all you're simply doing is some basic forms, ASP.NET today with HTML and AJAX and jQuery work great, and HTML5 will give you some additional richness, but the reality is a lot of that basics work great today, making it be a server-side based app. At the same time, if you're trying to build like a call center app, or you're trying to build a really rich UI app, or something that has a lot of processing, that's where if you require a lot of client-side logic and behavior, today things can break down less from there's a missing API and more from how does my app stay easy to maintain and code and add features to. That's where we think Silverlight for line of business apps inside the browser adds a ton of value. And so, again, I kind of differentiate from, is it a simple form editing app? Is it a really rich line of business app? Those are two kind of endpoint distinctions, and there's obviously somewhere in the middle where that curve is. A lot of it comes down to what your personal preference is and what your flexibility, or what you're most comfortable with from a coding perspective. The great thing is you can use .NET both on the client and on the server, regardless of which option you choose. So either option works great with .NET and with Visual Studio. A couple of people have asked about model view model frameworks. So Andre and Dina both asked about MVVM. For people that don't know what MVVM stands for, it stands for Model View Model. And the easiest way to think about this is it's conceptually kind of like a model view controller or MVC framework for the something's on me there. So we have MVC, which is a pattern-based framework on the server. MVVM is basically a pattern you can use on the client side, in particular with Serverlite and WPF, to also have kind of a patterns-based approach. And the benefit with this is it enables better testing, sometimes makes it a little bit easier to kind of evolve your app, and there's lots of good benefits with that. You will see richer MVVM support being added to our tools going forward. That is something. That is definitely something that we're looking at and thinking about going forward. Timothy said, I saw a video of Andrew doing some script-style execution, sort of a C#5 preview of controlling a compiler in a runtime environment. Can you ask him to ship that feature ASAP? Yep. No, I know he wants to ship it ASAP. I do know that. So yeah, it's and Andrew said someone else asked. I tweeted last night because I was in a meeting with Andrew yesterday, and he was telling me about some of his language ideas for the next release of C#. Andrew's is great and has a ton of really good ideas. Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of exciting stuff happening in both VB and C# space going forward. Let's see, other quick questions. Side, you asked the question, what are the plans for native development in Windows Phone 7? You have a large C++ code base. We haven't announced any native support for Windows Phone 7, and there probably won't be for the first release. If you shoot me an email, I can put you in touch with the Windows Phone team, and they can talk to you about kind of what they recommend and ways to potentially help with that. Other questions? Dinesh asked, is the Windows Identity Framework part of the .NET Framework? If not, is there a plan for it? I'm going to confess, I'm not 100% sure. I think it is, actually. It's not built on IT. I'm pretty sure that the Identity Framework is part of .NET 4. It's either part of .NET 4 or it's part of App Fabric, I think, which is a separate set of extensions for .NET 4. It's free as well. If you send me an email, I can find out for sure, though, for you. John asked a question about WSHTTP binding support for WCF services in Silverlight. With each release of Silverlight, the web service support has gotten richer and richer. I don't actually run the WCF team, so I don't know 100%. But again, if you send me an email at skygu@microsoft.com, I'll put you in touch with the WCF team, and they can get you an exact answer for the specific scenarios. We do support, obviously, WCF bindings and HTTP binding with Silverlight and WCF. But if you send me an email, I can find out for sure what the plan is there. He asked us a question about ASP.NET MVC and ASP compat. So in other words, sort of, if you call a legacy COM object and you need to invoke it with an SDA thread, what's the best way to do that? good question. Send me email, and I will hook you up with the team to figure out what the best way to do that is. It's a good question. I haven't heard that one before. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Convergence asked the question, are there plans to simplify chaining of web service requests? So in other words, I think this is with regards to async programming. And are we looking to make it easier to chain multiple asynchronous web service calls? And if so, how? There is definitely plans to make that type of scenario, that type of async scenario, a lot easier. And so, yeah, that is definitely something we're looking at from both a runtime and a language perspective. How do we continue to make that easier? Because obviously we know that is going to be super common both for server and client apps going forward. Eli asked the question around, do we think will there be a day come when we don't choose between WPF and Silverlight, and we just make XAML apps that run in all supported platforms? That's certainly kind of where we're going towards. We're kind of driving towards that. We have kind of what's plan we call kind of our convergence plan, where, obviously from a concept perspective, Silverlight and WPF share, for the most part, all the same concepts. And even from an API code perspective, we've tried to build them so that the APIs are consistent. The runtime implementations are slightly different, though. What we're driving towards is having a single runtime that we can client, XAML runtime that runs everywhere, and you can use for both broad reach devices as well as and also for dev apps. So that is definitely where we're going. You asked another question, which is MVC doesn't seem to have as much interest in your local community. What can be done to increase interest? I think you're going to see more interest in MVC going forward, really come about through two or three things. One is, just with ES 2010 shipping, we generally see things that are built into the box get even more interest in separate web downloads. And so the fact that MVC2 is now just built into VS 2010, probably means a lot of people are going to give it a look that weren't even a couple months ago, even though it was available as a download for VS 2008. I think the other thing you're going to see us do, and this is sort of a focus I'm pushing more personally, actually, is how do we, for both MVC and for web forms, and for EF, and for all the things that we ship, how do we help people come up to speed quicker on them? So in other words, not just throw out advanced tutorials, but what are kind of the getting started tutorials that, allow you to learn something new without having to invest hours or weeks or months trying to come up to be proficient. And, you'll see this with our websites. You'll see more sample apps, more end-to-end apps, more tutorials. Again, you're going to see that for both web forms and MVC. I mentioned earlier in this talk a new MVC tutorial. If you go to the API.net/MVC website, and you scroll down, it's called the MVC Music tutorial. You're going to see that. We're still in beta phase. It's like a 0.8 release, but it's a nice kind of end-to-end walkthrough of building an app. You'll see us kind of enhance that more and build more of those type of tutorials in the future, which hopefully makes it easier to come up to speed on any type of new technology. Tyler asked, how have the Kin phones been selling? To be honest with you, I have no idea. I'm not in the mobile groups. I actually don't know off the top of my head. Rod asked the question, if you're developing Silverlight 3 apps using VS 2008, does the installation of Silverlight 4 cause problems for those developers? I don't believe it causes problems. If you send me mail, though, I can find out for sure for you and let you know. And then just asked a question, how would you compare Silverlight versus ASP.NET and MVC? Well, they are different. They're both .NET apps. They both use Visual Studio. One is obviously a very much client-side technology. MVC is much more of a server-side technology that then works with HTML and AJAX on the client. I think they're both both great technologies. They're sort of for slightly different scenarios, and what we try to do is, how do we have really sharp knives, so to speak, in our toolbox that make it great to build a client app, make it great to build a server app, and wherever it's possible, share as much concepts as possible. Brian H. asked a question about the Silverlight streaming service of the silverlight.live.com service. Is there support to kind of enable a free streaming service for Silverlight? That is something we're looking at, so that is something we're definitely looking at, and hopefully as part of Azure might be something we might be able to enable. Let's see what else. Isaac asked a question about how do we see the future of WPF and Silverlight. I kind of mentioned briefly about kind of the sort of convergence plan that we're on, which is to kind of bring the feature set closer and closer together, and ultimately, ideally, share as much implementation code as possible as well. Even with Silverlight 4 and WPF 4, you can see that. WPF 4 added features like animation easing, things like visual style management or VSM, some of the cache composition APIs that were in previous versions of Silverlight. And obviously then with Silverlight 4, we added a bunch of features that used to only be in WPF 4. So we have been steadily driving the feature sets to be closer and closer together from a compatibility perspective. But that is definitely something that we're focusing on. Mark asked a question about TFS 6000 build agent machines. I honestly don't know the answer, but shoot an email, and I will connect you up with the TFS team and definitely get you an answer on that. James asked a question about Windows 7, single-threaded versus multi-threaded. Windows Phone 7 is actually multi-threaded, so you can absolutely create threads even with the CTPs today within both your Silverlight and XNA apps and build multi-threaded apps. That is possible. I think what you're referring to is multitasking, meaning can you actually have multiple instances of multiple apps running at the same time? The operating system itself is a multitasking operating system, so it technically supports that. Right now with the current previews, we do kind of use sort of frankly the same model that the iPhone uses today, where you kind of launch one app at a time and the user quickly can switch between them. I don't know the time frame for when we are looking to add multitasking, yeah. No, I don't think multitasking. Multiple apps at the same time. But it is multi-threaded today. So you can definitely be multi-threaded. Ryan asked a question, sort of a good philosophical question. What moment do you believe was pivotal to the acceptance of the .NET framework to the industry? I think early in the phase of the .NET framework, I think ASP.NET played a big role, in terms of kind of driving a lot of adoption of the .NET framework. It's still the technology that's used the most within the .NET framework. I think more recently, in the enterprise space, things like WCF and workflow make a huge difference to enterprises, especially ones that are doing Java-based, enterprise backend solutions. Silverlight also, I think, given us a big boost in a bunch of other segments as well, not just media, but increasingly, I think, for ISV and SaaS-based solutions. So, there's lots of different points in time where I can say, I think, that was a pivotal moment in terms of driving acceptance. I'd say in terms of waves of adoption, I think the big waves that we saw were, with 2002 and 2003 at the beginning, there was a big wave of initial adoption. 2005 was for us a big wave where, a lot of people said, okay, finally, this is something I can adopt. And so we saw a huge spike in adoption then. We saw, I'd say continual gradual adoption with 2008. People said, hey, that was a good release. But we didn't see as big a spike as with 2005. I'm betting right now that we're going to see as big a spike with 2010 as we saw with the previous two releases. I'm amazed how many people have actually already deployed it and are using it as their primary IDE. I did a talk in Phoenix on Monday for about 700 people, and I think about a quarter of the room, or maybe even a third of the room, was using it as their primary IDE now, which, given it, we're basically exactly, I think, today at the 1 month mark of it being available for download. It's not a bad adoption curve. And I think a lot of people are pretty excited about the new release. So hopefully we'll see, even more adoption and more uptake in the year or two ahead. Aaron asked, when will VS 2010 support the SQL Server integration service projects? Good question. I think the team's working hard on that right now. That's actually managed by the SQL team. I think there's a blog post that they've done recently that you can learn more about that. Let's see. Unfortunately, we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to do a couple last questions here. Andre asked a question about what software I recommend for measuring GPU resources. If you send me mail, I will connect you up with a guy named Rob Relia, who helps us run WPF, and he can point you to a bunch of good resources out there that you can use to measure performance and do perf tuning, and so can help with that. I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Ravaji asked about .NET open source community. How do I think about that, and how do we create an even richer ecosystem? This is something I am thinking, I do think a lot about, and I think we actually do have a good .NET open source community in the sense of there's a lot of great projects out there. I'd like it to be a lot bigger, and I'd like to see even more projects out there. And so I do think you're going to see us do more, hopefully in the months and year ahead, to try to embrace more open source projects and drive more interest in them as a first phase, and do more in terms of sponsoring and making it easier for people to create projects around them. So that is definitely something that that we're focused on and looking to do more of. So yeah, definitely. Cornelia asked the question, what's the current Silverlight adoption rate, and what's a good resource to track the progress yourselves? We use a variety of different measures. Some of them kind of companies that do surveys for us, and we measure kind of on popular websites Silverlight deployment. We're about 60% worldwide, and which is great. We're very, very happy about that. In terms of sites, there's a couple different sites out there. Reastatus.com is one of them. That shows about 60% as well. So there's a variety of different sites you can use. Lastly, what do I do for fun in my spare time? I have a 2-year-old, so I spend a lot of time with my 2-year-old, and obviously my wife. Yeah, my son takes up a lot of my spare time. And I also read, and what else? And I actually collect stamps. So anyway, those are 3 things I do. I don't have nearly as much spare time as I'd like, and I do like to travel. Sometimes for work, but often for pleasure. So I do try to have some spare time and do some fun stuff there. I apologize. I think we're out of time. There's still one.
Scott, hi, this is Inbar. Just wanted to wrap this up, and thank you so much for spending another 90 minutes and answering all those questions. I keep being amazed how many questions there are and how many questions are still there. And I hope you come again in a few months so you can keep answering the questions.
Yeah, I definitely will. For people that are on the call that maybe came in a little late, we will actually, these sessions are recorded, so you can download the audio of them later. And so if you go back to my blog, I'll put an update link on my blog post announcing this talk on weblogs.asp.net/Scott Gu, and also